And just putting this into the right page. Course activity video. One day I'll figure this out so that all I have to do is click a button and everything works. Okay, back to it's in the waiting room. Now let's try. That's better. All right. Mark is purple. And mark is non-purple.
That's my Ubuntu purple.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, purple and orange are their unusual color combination that they've stuck with.
All right.
I must say.
Give you a little volume there so I can hear you nice and clearly.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Now I'm just going to grab a wee bit more coffee. I'll be right back, and Sharita will join. And we're live on YouTube, so YouTube gets to see me go get coffee.
When an elementary school has an outbreak, how that ripples through the family, even those vaccinated members of the family.
All right. And I'm back, and we have Sharita waiting in the waiting room.
Good.
All right. Nice to have everybody here again.
The gang's all here. Did you ever hear from Brian?
No.
He was in the first week. I think his name was Brian. Huh.
So, yeah, there do seem to be people following along, though, because I hear mentions of it from time to time in Twitter and other places and unexpected places. So,
yeah, and you were aggregated in an email I got.
Oh, really?
The course was aggregated in an email I got.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I can forward it to you. I thought about it, but I don't think I did it. Good morning, Sharita, or good afternoon, Sharita.
Thank you.
All right.
Afternoon.
Okay, I've turned on the audio recording now as well. So for the audio recording and for the video recording, because I'll probably trim the front of this, I'm getting better at that. I was having issues with that. This is Ethics Analytics and the Duty of Care, module, 5, part 2, the discussion. And I'm really glad we took the time to have the extra week. It gave me some breathing time, yay. And I guess you guys some breathing time. And it also allowed me to take the time to explore some of these topics the way I felt they deserved to be explored. which I think is good. I hope it's good. And also, I've adjusted a wee bit. I've been putting more links to articles in the newsletter. I had forgotten that I used to do that with my MOOCs, and it was always a good idea. And I had focused so much on doing these videos that it sort of blinded me to, all the other stuff. But for my own purposes, doing the videos has been really productive. I don't know if they've been as productive for you guys, but they've really helped me a lot in my thinking about a lot of this stuff. I've got one more lined up. I'm almost prepared. I'll be doing it right after this session. I'll be recording it. So if you're actually curious, you'll be able to watch that live, because I live stream them when I record them, which creates some interesting dynamics because, of course, I'm live streaming them, which means basically I'm blurting out the video beginning to end. I'm not working from a script, and that shows. But I am working from the slides and some text that I've compiled ahead of time, which keeps me on track. And I don't know. Have you guys followed the videos, especially from this module?
I've been listening and or viewing.
Okay.
Most of them. I'll go in a certain way, and then I got to do something else, and then I'll come back and.
Yeah.
But I find them really interesting. It's almost, I've never taken a course in philosophy. So, listening and, looking at the videos, certainly towards, the end of, middle of last week and then this week, I feel like I'm taking a course on philosophy.
Yeah.
But that's okay. Right?
Yeah. Obviously, in the course with ethics in the title, it would be kind of surprising if the philosophy didn't come into it.
Yeah.
So, and, there was the danger at the beginning of the course, I think, that, it was also technical, and also analytical, with all the divisions of all the different applications of ethics, etc. So this part provides a bit of an antidote to that, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Although it would be useful, and I think as time goes by, I want to create some visual aids to some of this stuff as well. I have the videos, I have the text, but I don't really, I created for the very first module a nice graphic with all the applications. I haven't done that with any of the other stuff since then, and it takes a bit of time to do, but I'd like to do that, especially for the philosophy section. Although, the point that I'm trying to reach with this philosophy section is that, I don't want to say it quite this way, but the philosophical approach to ethics is useless. Now that's a bit strong, but the whole approach of philosophy, and especially over the last 500 years, and especially recently, but the whole approach to philosophy of rationalizing and applying decision theory of some sort to how we should all select ethical actions, as though there were really any real doubt in our mind about what constitutes right and wrong. To me, all of that seems misplaced, and I think that the discussion of the different ethical theories shows that. it certainly does to my mind. I don't know if I'd satisfy another philosopher that it does, but that's the whole point. I mean, I'm not in the business of satisfying other philosophers. And that's, I think, where they get led astray. They feel that they need to make an argument that would convince other philosophers. But I learned in my study of philosophy, you'd never convince other philosophers. It never works. And they go into these interminable discussions that never end, and nothing gets resolved. And, it's like early in my career, early being kind of relative, so I think it was like 40, in my 30s maybe, I read something from Robert Nozick on philosophical explanations, which seems to me to be a bit of a better approach, and it's something I adopted with respect to my own work since then, and that is, I can't argue in favor of my position on this, that, or the other thing. Because if you don't believe it, you're not going to be convinced by the argument. But I can explain what I'm doing. And if I explain what I'm doing, at least you can get a sense of what I'm thinking. Mm-hmm. Right? And then you make your own judgment, which may or may not be influenced by my explanation. It's something I have no real control over. And it's sort of pointless to keep trying. And I think that something like that applies to ethics as well. Although in ethics, we're not really in the business of offering explanations, properly so called. And that's part of the difficulty. But I think certainly we're not in the business, or shouldn't be in the business, of offering arguments. Probably can't be in the business of offering explanations. And, it's this intractable thing. Most people, not everybody, because there are people who are, what's that word? Is it psychotic, or people who have no empathy? Most people, though, have a sense of ethics. Most people have a sense of right and wrong, whatever that happens to be. We could try to come up with generalizations through some sort of process of descriptive ethics, but it would be pointless. Because there just isn't enough commonality. And ethics, as they show up in individual people, depend so much on the situation and the context and the background and the knowledge. I've got a nice item from David Weinberger, which just came out this week. It's in my slideshow that I'll be creating right after this session. Talking about the role machine learning plays just in understanding the world, but it's the same thing with ethics. And the idea is that, I'm just scrolling to it so I can find it here. So he says, in the complaint that we don't know how machine learning works, we also hear that these models do indeed work. And machine learning models work because they're actually better at reading the world than we are. And I think that's true. They take into account much more complex phenomena than we ever could. There's one example he has, and I'm just paraphrasing here. He says, a machine learning model will say that one thing causes another, but it can also catch those contexts in which you can say one thing causes another only if another 50 factors are present. And if those other 50 factors are present, then the causal relationship holds. And that's the sort of inference about reality. Is pretty much impossible for us to draw out and characterize. And so he says, and I agree, I'm about to sneeze, sorry. Shoo, there's some professional video for you.
Solid.
Yeah. Our encounter with machine learning models doesn't deny that there are generalizations, laws, or principles. I can be indifferent about that, but it denies that they are sufficient for understanding what happens in a universe as complex as ours. And I think all of that is true of ethics as well. I sometimes paraphrase it as words are far too blunt an instrument to be applied to the domain of knowledge. They just don't capture. It's like using a sledgehammer to. I'm trying to come up with an analogy here. Using a sledgehammer to pin a poster to the wall. It's not much of an example, but maybe if I thought about it, I could come up with a better one. In educational technology, I often say, it's like using a battleship to cross a river. Although, again, I think that's true. And that's what my investigation leads me to think. But I don't know. Mark, you've been quiet. What do you think?
Well, I was just about to jump in. So again, I'm not educated by contemporary standards. And I agree, back at the beginning, I agreed with you. I looked at philosophy pretty hard on my own when I was young. And I basically reached your same conclusion. And I saved myself, a lot of years of study and tens of thousands of dollars. That it just isn't useful. But I continue to follow along. So I really enjoyed the video that I was watching this morning. I almost got to the end on social contract, skipping through philosophy, very well, I have to say, tying it together. So what I was about to say is you just made some statements about machine learning and how it can take in more of the universe to reach its conclusions. And as a person who made a conscious decision not to go and get educated, machine learning has no idea about reality or the universe. It's completely disconnected from it and sitting on a silicon chip. And that's why I became a craftsman, because I wanted to engage with reality. Taking materials, applying energy, some people call that work, yep, and creating things that are useful. So that makes me a utilitarian, sort of. And this is one of my problems with higher education, is it's disconnected from reality. Being based on language and metaphor, analogy, simile. And the bottom line is it's unrelated to people walking down the street in a primary way, in a foundational way, which is why it's skeptically looked at, not just in the United States. What our culture particularly has that thread. And then I do have to mention my favorite philosopher. So after 2008, when I was no longer a professional craftsman because all the jobs disappeared, I went back to my first profession, selling books. And so the book I kept on the counter was a book of philosophy. It was very small, and I tried to sell it to as many people as possible. It was small and cheap. And it's called On Bullshit, by Harry Frankfurt.
Yep.
And little did I know that that was the key book to the next couple of political administrations.
Yeah, that book did have quite an impact. I found it a bit dry, personally.
The philosophers probably didn't think very highly of it, but
well,
the pedestrians liked it.
no, it's well argued. I just wish he had written it in a more approachable way, but I think I think he makes some good points.
Rita, are you familiar with the book I'm referring to?
No.
Why don't you summarize it for her?
Well, I was going to suggest that the philosopher do it, but I'll tell you what I took away from it, and you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting it. He said basically that there are, three kinds of utterances: a true statement of a fact, a false statement of a fact. There are two subcategories. One is mistaken, and one is by that sociopath or psychopath you mentioned earlier, who doesn't care whether it's true or false. It just gets them what they need.
Yeah.
Which I thought described the Trump administration.
And the other side of it is that an awful lot of academia, an awful lot of discussion generally is of that third category.
Yes.
And that's the thing that I think is really important. I had, when I was a graduate student, I had some really interesting experiences when famous philosophers would come to visit, but also had some really disappointing ones. And the disappointing ones, I thought, were the ones that treated philosophy as a game. And what they were doing is just saying whatever they thought they could get away with saying. I thought that David K. Lewis was one of those. One of his papers, for example, is The Ontology of Holes. Okay, maybe there's an interesting question there. I mean, it's the old standard, right? How many holes does a straw have? And you might think, well, it has two, one at each end. But of course, it's one continuous hole, or maybe there isn't a hole in a straw at all. Or maybe if you slice it vertically, there's an infinite number of holes. Okay, but it's not a real problem. Another one that I felt was like that was Jerry Fodor. And Jerry Fodor advanced the idea that we have a fully developed language of thought already in our mind, pre-born, ready to go, and all the words and all the concepts that we're going to use in our life and all the grammatical rules, everything already exists in our head pre-born. And then we, and the process of learning them really is just stripping away all the cruft around them and allowing them to emerge, which I think is complete nonsense, because I'm pretty sure I wasn't born with, say, the idea of radar in my head or the idea of exoplanets in my head. But Fodor's theory is a natural extension of Chomsky's theory that there's an innate grammar in our head. And Chomsky meant it seriously, but Fodor was just playing. And so these things, I think, would be categorized as Frankfurt's bullshit. But of course, we've seen, as you mentioned, Mark, in wider society, this elevated to a high art form by some of our politicians. And that's when it becomes an ethical issue too, I think. The people who are doing it think, well, it's a game. And it's just what I can get away with, what levers I can pull, how much leverage I have, what I can get out of it.
Yeah, and this is the uh, problem challenge idea that I've been struggling with in returning to higher education. Is it seems that each silo or field or discipline is being played as a game, and that it seems to me from the outside, well, not from the outside, I mean, I'm actually enrolled in a university. It seems that the primary purpose is the preservation of the institution, and that the primary subject is creating more teachers and administrators. Then secondary is now it's become a job training center for corporations. I'm old enough to remember when corporations train their own people. You know, I'm not that old. I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that, you know, I'm not like 800 years old. I mean, like a few decades ago, you could go into the mail room or the packaging room, and you could end up, if not the president of the company, you could end up a vice president of something, strictly through internal training. And now you can't submit an application without a bachelor's degree, and I don't have a bachelor's degree. So basically, I can't apply for a job in the United States of America. And I think that's a problem, especially when 70% of the people who live here don't have a bachelor's degree. So what is going on? So there's that. And then before I forget, I did want to pick a nit too. You described Hutchison as Irish, but he was actually Ulster Scot. And then you didn't define Adam Smith or David Hume as Scottish. And so I really like to point out that it's the Scots that created this world. And that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's kind of true. So that's another one of my themes I'm working on, because there's this term Scotch, which is how I'm feeling economically and kind of culturally these days in the United States. Scotch to be, you know, in the rest of the Americas means to be disappeared, as the term most often used. And I just mean culturally, obviously nobody's disappeared me yet.
I haven't heard that here.
Oh, you haven't? Oh, that's what when you picked up off the street and thrown in an unmarked van and dropped out of a helicopter, which is something we promoted, the U.S. government promoted not that long ago. That's called disappeared.
Disappeared, I've heard of.
Yeah. Disappeared, yeah. So you know, now it's spreading from a physical fact to a cultural fact, and you know, cancel culture can be part of that. Canceling people is disappearing them, you know. But again, on this silicon platform, not the carbon-based life form.
So yeah, I'm not going to delve into the politics of Ulster Scotch. I'll just point out that my own background is Irish, pretty Irish, with a little bit of English mixed in because that's the history of the Irish. But yeah, I mean, Hume and Smith definitely part of the Scottish Enlightenment. No question about it. I think I actually used the word Scottish Enlightenment in my most recent video, but I'm not positive. I know I've used it recently. So
Might have used Scottish. Yeah.
There is a recognition there that they are Scottish.
Well, and to me, you know, the reason I bring it up is our cultures, I think I can say to this group, our cultures or culture, you know, was heavily influenced, let's say, if not originated through the Scottish Enlightenment. And it's completely forgotten. I think I mentioned another time we were talking, Stephen, that there are no Scottish studies in the United States.
Right.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah, and that seems odd to me.
Doesn't it seem odd? You so I'm wandering around higher education and, and then I started going to conferences, meeting people from multiple institutions. And I started thinking that, in the larger sense and looking across all of North America, there's only a couple, Guelph and Simon Fraser, UBC. So that just seems odd to me, the foundation of your culture, and nobody's explicitly studying it that I can find.
It's interesting because where I live here in Canada, I'm just on the fringes of an area known as Glengarry. So Glengarry County, which is part of a larger county now, which is deeply Scottish. It's got towns like Alexandria and Maxville and Dunvegan and others. They have the Highland Games every year, and the water tower for Maxville actually has a tartan on it. So there's a very strong Scottish presence, very close to where I live. But of course, the town where I live, or village more accurately, is about 60% Franco-Ontarian. So it's interesting. I literally live right on this dividing line between cultures. Such that I can move between several cultures just by taking a bike ride, and I personally like that. I like the idea that we have these different cultures that we can identify, reasonably clearly and trace their influence to. And anyone who studies philosophy, I think, to any depth at all, is going to see the influence of multiple cultures on our society through history. And we think typically of the Anglo-Saxon kinds of cultures, but also there are the Norwegian cultures or the Danish cultures, which are huge in England, but as well everything from Buddhism to Indian philosophy to these days Ubuntu and other kinds of philosophies come into the mix as well. And I think that's a good thing, personally. And I think it's worth looking at the influence of each of these cultures individually. And I also think it's interesting looking at how they interact and how they, work together in different environments. But again, that's where a discipline like ethics becomes really difficult, because each one of these cultures brings with it its own tradition of what's valued, what are virtues, how society should be organized, what principles constitute fairness, etc. And I think we can come to the idea that we have something like a common system of ethics only if we never look outside our own particular culture.
That's the problem that I see. Again, born and raised in California, and my mother's from New Mexico, the state, that's pretty equally divided between natives, what we used to call, Richard Nixon actually invented the term Hispanic. So what we used to call Mexicans or Mexican Americans, and then Anglos. So I've grown up in a multicultural situation between Los Angeles and there. Yeah. And actually, Charles Taylor's the next philosopher on my bookshelf, but it's actually more of a doorstop than a book. So I haven't gotten to it yet. So I don't know about your next video, but it seems that we need a meta ethics, right? Just the rules of how these multiple ethics can engage nonviolently or politically, so because it's interesting, looking at all these ethical systems, and the more I look at them, the more I see that my ethics are just this Venn diagram of my literal settler relatives, homesteaders, and the Los Angeles public school system. I mean, so it's a very weird set of ethics I have. Mostly individualistic, but then I was in Silicon Valley. I was glad to see that you brought the libertarians in. They're often left out of these discussions.
Oh, it'd be irresponsible not to mention it.
Well, it seems to me, and yet even in California, like they're just not, they're Scotch. It's like, don't talk about that, even though, we have Peter Thiel wandering around.
Right.
So this whole thing is so fraught. And that's what this is, that's been my experience through this course, right? It's just like there's so many ethical systems and they're all, rigged or whatever, slanted, whatever to the advantage of the people writing the system. That's, here we are. It's like,
One thing that this conversation is kind of triggering in my mind is that one of the areas that's been built up, at least in Canada, probably in the US as well, has been the whole area of Indigenous or First Nation thought, et cetera, et cetera. So, Stephen, have you looked at any of the philosophy that comes from our First Nations? And I'm sure there are lots, because I can't really say First Nations for everybody in Canada.
Yeah. And that actually, when we move into the philosophy of care, we'll actually talk about that to some degree. There's the, if you will, traditional philosophy of care, but there are Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of thinking about ethics. For example, two-way seeing is such a phenomenon. And in Canada, of course, as well, we have, words like two-spirit, which I don't think are present outside of Canada. And that's, again, an Indigenous concept. And I think Indigenous ways of knowing create challenges because I'm so tempted to just say because they're wrong, which is a terrible thing to say, and of course goes against everything else I've been saying in this course. So I'm not going to say that they're wrong, but they're certainly not the way that I see the world. And the question is, how do you accommodate that? Accommodate even is the wrong word. I mean, how do you value and embrace that, perhaps, is a better way of putting it. And the important thing here is that we need to. It's like, how do you value and embrace Christianity without becoming a Christian? How do you value and embrace Indigenous spirituality without adopting Indigenous spirituality? It's a hard question, particularly when both of those exist side by side in your own community and are being expressed by people in the community. And then on top of that, there is the long history in this country of racist practices, including the effort to exterminate the Indigenous cultures in this country through the use of such devices as oppressive laws and residential schools, etc. And even now, it's difficult for people to accept that. How could we as an ethical people actually have tried to do that? And you reach the inevitable conclusion, well, it wasn't really very ethical to try to do that. The other thing, though, is none of the people who, well, I shouldn't say that. I was going to say none of the people who tried to do that are still with us, but that's not true either. It's,
going on right now.
I actually taught, when I was working in First Nations communities in Alberta, I actually taught people who had grown up in residential schools. And in some of the cases, ironically and interestingly, we were back in the same residential school where they had been forcibly put. And so it was kind of an odd experience. For example, when I was teaching at the residential school just outside St. Paul, I was working with Blue Quills, and they at first, because it was some distance from Edmonton, I would go stay overnight and then teach in the morning. And they suggested, well, why don't you stay at the school? We've got all these rooms you can stay in. And people talked about, but you're going to have to confront the spirits of all the dead people that are there. And in the end, I stayed at a motel in St. Paul, mostly because I wanted coffee and there wasn't coffee. And I still have a big coffee carafe that the students bought me because there were no services at all at this residential school where everybody had to come for me to teach philosophy to them. And I didn't take seriously, this whole idea that, there were spirits in the attic of this school. But maybe I should have taken it more seriously, given what we now know about the bodies buried outside. But it's interesting to me because even while I was there, I knew about the residential school system. Now, this was in the, would have been in the 1980s, early 1990s that I was doing this. It's just after the residential schools basically shut down and were being repurposed. And for the most part, they were just big empty shells of buildings that people were trying to find other uses for. So I knew about that, and I knew about the impact because they told me about the impact, and it's one of the things we talked about in these classes. But in an important way, I didn't know about the impact either. Mm-hmm. So, it's one thing, and this is, and I actually am answering your question. It's one thing to sit there and take, if you will, a rationalist perspective about Indigenous ways of knowing and other such things, and to interpret all of that literally in the sense that these are statements that have truth values. These are statements that have semantical imports if and only if they correspond exactly to states of affairs in the world, or even these are statements that make sense only if they can be interpreted as principles of conduct. In my metaethics talk, I refer to the movie Tracks, which is an Australian film about a woman who learns how to manage camels and then walks with her camels across the Australian outback and comes into interaction with Aboriginal peoples and Aboriginals' ways of living, including some of the principles, like, for example, women don't handle the knife. And you think of that as, if you just think of that as an ethical principle, it seems like really wrong. But if you think of it as a reflection of the culture and the way of life, as something that can and should be literally applied in particular circumstances, especially on Aboriginal lands with Aboriginal people, then it begins to make more sense. And particularly when you tie it to this context, not just of the historical cultural values, but the lived experience that they have right now, in the case of Australia, with the challenges to their culture and their land and the people and the history of disease, and in Canada, the history of residential schools and the attempt to essentially eradicate the culture. All of that forms part of the truth of one of these statements. But again, it's not a true false kind of thing. And in my own thinking about statements generally, I can't actually convince myself that there's such a thing as truth or literal truth or falsity of statements. And rather, if I'm forced to define what I mean by that, I would define it as, the degree to which I can't not think of that statement or something like that, right? It's just, it's a statement about me, not a statement about the nature of the world. And so Indigenous knowledge is a statement about them, but also a statement about me with respect to my relationship with them. And now I'm on the way to something, that now I'm on the way to being able to say, well, okay, here are these people who literally believe that there are spirits in the attic, possibly those of the children who died while at residential school, except it doesn't make sense to say that they literally believe it, even if they actually do literally believe it, because that's not the right way to understand it. And that's how you have these different ways of seeing the world, these different ways of understanding the world. And, on the one hand, and this is important, if you come from the logical analytical tradition, which, by the way, I did, then it really sounds like a lot of hand waving. And I really am self-critical about hand waving. I don't want to hand wave. I want to be precise in what I say and exact in how I express it. But on the other hand, words are too blunt an instrument to express it. Like Michael Polanyi used to talk about tacit knowledge. And the essence of tacit knowledge is that it is literally ineffable. It cannot be expressed in words. And how do you assess the truth or falsity of a proposition that cannot be expressed in words? But that's the reality of Indigenous knowledge. And that's what takes me back to that bit about David Weinberger and talking about machine learning and about it being way too complex. It works, but it's way too complex. If you think, as I think, that there is a commonality between human learning and machine learning, that a lot of the processes are the same, then those statements apply to what we know as well as to what machines know. We can know things without being able to say how we know these things or what justifies what we know. And I think the evidence of that is the fact that we do that. And one of the instances in which we do that is ethics, where we know things, but the 2,500-year-old project to explain what it is that we know and why it is that we know it has been, to my mind, an utter failure. And the evidence of that is the fact that it's so hard for our culture to comprehend what's going on in indigenous knowledge, because it is undeniably knowledge. That's my take on that.
This reminds me of the person that I found most helpful when you're in these conundrums, who was not a philosopher, but was a scientist, so he was a rationalist, John C. Lilly, who said that whatever you believe to be true is true, within certain limits, to be tested experimentally and verified. And it seemed to me that indigenous, and also I have to say that the certain indigenous cultures, because there's not one, obviously, certain indigenous cultures have been a fascination of mine. I can say literally since I was 5 years old because of my travels to New Mexico annually. And so I have spent an enormous amount of time, and I've come to the same conclusion you have. It's, I don't get it. But under John C. Lilly's theory, they have theorized these principles, if you want to call them ethical principles, and they've tested them repeatedly, and they've constructed a system. Now, we would say their tests weren't falsifiable, I guess, would be the first thing we would reach for as rational Westerners. But there's no denying that they've tested their beliefs and retained the ones they found most useful somehow. And I stumbled on a question this week because of my looking first for Scottish studies and then working class studies, which there's also a dearth of. So again, the majority of the population, there's no study of their culture or ethics that I can find. It's big in the United Kingdom. They recognize the classes and study them, but in the US, we have this theory there are no classes. So we have this one theory of class, which I would, we used to claim it was middle class, but then we economically eliminated them. So it's a very fraught subject. So I came to this question this week because of my struggles with higher education. Are all educational institutions residential schools? And you can't say. I mean, we treat them as if they're two separate things, but they're not. They came out of the same church at the same time in the same place. So that's my question to myself this week. Are all schools residential schools? And to bring it back to this course, that's what's so attractive about connectivism, because it's not institutionalized, and it may rely a little too heavily on individual agency, but at the same time, it's reaching for Ubuntu. It's reaching for this sharing of knowledge and building new knowledge collectively or communally or or I don't know, somewhere, all of which are banned in the United States. If it begins with com, you can't say it in the United States, and that includes Commonwealth, which is in the goddamn Declaration of Independence. So I use the word Commonwealth a lot. Yeah, that's my American out.
Yeah, you could also use the word Leviathan and just confuse your commentators, and you might mean more or less the same thing.
Another reason I abandoned philosophy is nobody in America cares at all.
And again, I'm really hesitant to classify all of America in a single statement. I mean, it's the same country that has Barack Obama has Florida man. There's such a wide variety. The culture that you described, for example, certainly is a culture. I don't know if it's a majority culture or not. I mean, there are huge other cultures in the US. The whole Silicon Valley culture is a culture. The Pacific Northwest thing, whatever they've got going on up there, it's something, again, different. And the US is interesting in the sense that it's got these cultural islands that are the cities, and each city is its own thing. And then, the rural hinterland, which is and there's a very distinct rural culture as compared to the urban culture. And then there's
There's also 6 or 8 of those.
Pardon?
There's also 6 or 8 of those. We tend to lump them together as the flyover culture, but.
Yeah, but not so. And that's probably true of most countries. I mean, Canada as well has this urban-rural divide. England has London and then everything else, and then Scotland, and then Ulster, which is its own thing. And Europe, well, Europe, right? Talk about multicultural. And, we go to India with its hundreds of individual languages. China, we depict as a monoculture, but, there are tensions between Mandarin and Cantonese. And then, of course, there's the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, the Mongolians, the Manchurians. And also in China, there's very much an urban-rural split. It's totally different in Beijing, which is as modern an industrial city as you can get. It's incredible. But outside Beijing, it's like being outside the city in North America. It's a very different environment. And I could go on, right?
So how does connectivism help us to draw these knowledges together? That's, I guess, my question for the moment.
So if I had to say it this way, because, I think of culture as an emergent property rather than a thing in and of itself. That's the rationalist me speaking. And when we talk about things like Ubuntu and relatedness and all of that, I want actual causal mechanisms. I'm picky that way. And again, call that a cultural bias, but that's part of what I think connectivism is, which is why I define a connection as a link between two entities such that a change of state in one of the entities can result in a change of state in the other entity, right? So you have these networks of interrelated people, and we can, we can also talk about the artifacts created by people, the contents they create, the concepts they exchange, however we want to define this. And there are different ways of defining it. Each way of defining it gives us a different network, as long as we have that causal connection between them so that the change of states can propagate. That's the basic understanding that I have, right? That's how I think brains work. That's how I think societies work. That's how I think that connectionist neural network systems work, right? There are these connected individuals. And you can say, well, you shouldn't look at it at that level. But I think then that we take concepts like culture, and for that matter, concepts like ethics, or to follow a David Hume kind of approach, concepts like cause and effect. It's all very circular, right? These are what are called emergent properties of this network of connections. And what that is a property of the network that exists as a result of the way the network is organized and operating. And the idea of an emergent property is that it's not the same as one of the, it's not the same as a property in one of the individual entities, right? It's not simply one of their properties writ large. It's something that exists over and above it. But its existence is kind of different in that it exists only if it is perceived or recognized by another neural network using the first neural network as input. So cultures are emergent properties, but cultures exist as things in and of themselves only to the extent that they are recognized as being cultures by a perceiver, for example, a person who studies cultures. Similarly with ethics, right? Ethics are emergent properties of the interaction of these entities in the network, all of these related entities, but they're really only recognized as entities by people who perceive them. And, if we had to say what they are patterns of phenomena in these networks. And so what we're doing when we look at these networks is we're looking at these patterns. But what are these patterns? What makes something a pattern? Only that it is recognized as a pattern. It's not a mathematical property. It's not an external property. It's not intrinsic to the network itself. It's just perceived as one. But that doesn't mean they don't have causal force. They certainly do. If you recognize a pattern in phenomena and respond to it, then that pattern has had causal force. And you need to tell the story. But so that's how this all, to me, all ties together.
So is the technology and the ethics or rules of the interaction, is that determinative? I mean, is that why we would want to dominate the production of the technology or dominate the rules making? Because it's determinative of the outcome?
Well, it influences the outcome, but it's, I mean, you're trying to get back to simple principles of motivation, and probably everybody who's involved in trying to dominate others has their own very complex individual story. That's one of the things about Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump is completely unique. And we see that and we think, oh man, weird. But every human is completely unique. It's just, we see it so clearly in Donald Trump. But I mean, a way of putting this that I think is relevant to a lot of what's happening today is that, there are competing ways of recognizing patterns and phenomena. There are, for example, ways of looking at the interactions of people in the world where you can say there is such and such a culture, there is such and such a culture, there is such and such a culture. And other ways where you say, well, here's a culture, but that one doesn't really exist. Right? And that's where you get your conflict now beginning to happen. Do you recognize something as a culture? Do you recognize an ethos as a valid ethic? Do you recognize indigenous ways of knowledge as knowledge, right? It's a recognition thing. And because it's recognition, we can trace it down to fact, but we can trace all of these recognitions down to fact. And there's none of them that has any particular inherent truth or value or strength or whatever over the others. And so for me, ethics is a question of, well, how can all of these things interplay together? But that's a much harder problem.
So does connectivism recognize groups, or is connectivism only relevant to individuals?
Connectivism hits that sweet halfway point between groups and individuals. So there are groups, there are individuals, but our typical understanding of them as undifferentiated entities in and of themselves is mistaken. And there's no individual that isn't embedded in and completely dependent upon the network. And there's no group that is completely self-sufficient over and above and independent of its individual entities that compose it. Both individuals and groups are ways of recognizing aspects of the patterns in the network. the patterns of perception.
Would you consider a technology an entity, or a robot?
Yeah,
Would you consider that an entity in a network?
it could be. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, why not? Right? Does it satisfy the conditions? Right? Does a change of state in it result in a change of state in something else? Say
Yes.
another robot or a person or a hydro plant. Yeah, sure, of course. Is it a self-aware entity? Well, that's a completely different question.
Right.
But sure, of course, it can be an entity in a network. A power plant can be an entity in a network. No problem with that. They're not very complex networks, but they don't have to be complex to be networks. It's just that the complexity of the phenomena that can be recognized in these networks is more limited. That's all.
So that leads me back to the weighting of connections. Because the robots are built by groups that are made up of individuals, but typically within a culture. And so if we can weight these connections, it might be helpful to point out that the artificial intelligence was created within this group, within this culture. And that would be it seems to me, a way to, judge is not the right word, analyze, that's not right either. But anyway.
Recognize. Recognize, see, perceive, detect.
Exactly.
Yeah. And weights can be and are used in that way. And one of the things that I did actually this week, because I had a little more time, so I went back to Matthias Melcher's charts and developed a way to put weight in all of the links. So now we can have thick links and thin links depending on the weights and also the nodes. So that was a little bit of fun. But the idea is now I take that back to all of these graph inputs that I've developed for the course. And now what I'll be able to do is, like I talked about before, take one of these grids, put it up on Twitter, have people reply, and then be able to weight the corresponding connections that are created between all the entities, and then draw the graph with thick lines or thin lines, depending on the weight. And then we just look at it and we see, right? And that's what I mean by emergent phenomena, right? We look at this chart and we just see, oh yeah, I can see this flow, this movement, or this cluster, or whatever. So, but next week, we begin to look at some of these ideas. And I think we look at them in their messy formulation as what has come to be called the duty of care. But it's a formulation that it goes beyond just the pedagogy of care or the epistemology of care as expressed by the feminist theories, but it looks at that kind of concept more broadly, something that is more relational, something that is not rationally defined or not described using the typical language of rationality, which makes it really fuzzy and hard to get our hands on. But at the same time, when we look at this, we can see that, oh yeah, no, they're on to something there. And it's something that's feeding back in. And this is just simply a matter of observation. It is something that's feeding back into the ethics of artificial intelligence. But what it is and how it's feeding back in is an interesting question. So I hope you're looking forward to that. I know I am. So I gotta go because I have to record another video, which will start probably in about 10 or 15 minutes. So if you're curious, that it'll just be on my YouTube channel. Are you both able to find my YouTube channel?
Mhm.
Okay, good. Because that's where it'll be. And so you'll see that, me wrapping up some of that discussion. You'll probably see echoes of this discussion in that video. And then I get into a car, drive to Montreal, and go watch a football game.
Ah,
So that's my weekend.
Canadian football?
Canadian football, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, also known as real football.
Yeah.
All right, then. So
okay.
talk to you all later.
Yep. Have a good
Um,
weekend.
Thanks. I will.
I hope your team wins.
Yeah, me too. Although they're in last place and out of the playoffs. So, you can only hope for so much.